Welcome to The Explainer. Let's jump right in. Today, we're unpacking the life of a leader whose presidency is often viewed as a catastrophic prelude to the American Civil War. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States. We're going to explore a truly fascinating narrative of how a man's rigid political ideology, combined with unimaginable personal tragedy, inadvertently accelerated a nation's path to war. It's a story about the actual mechanics of political collapse, and today, we're going to visualize exactly how it all went down. When Franklin Pierce ran for president back in 1852, he didn't just win, he absolutely dominated. He secured a massive landslide victory, capturing 254 electoral votes. His opponent, Winfield Scott, he only managed 42. Pierce carried 27 of the 31 states. That number, 254, is a massive testament to his incredibly broad, cross-country appeal at the exact moment he took office. But, that leads us right to the central paradox of our explainer today. How on earth did a unifying landslide victor, a guy who essentially had a mandate from the entire country, completely lose his own party's support just 4 years later? It is a spectacular political collapse. So to understand this mystery, we really have to look at where he came from and the beliefs that anchored him. Section 1. Rise of a Dark Horse. Born into a politically active New Hampshire family, Pierce's political ascent was, it was incredibly rapid. Armed with a strict, unyielding adherence to states' rights and a limited federal government, he entered the state legislature in 1829. He was just 24 years old. By 1833, he was in the U.S. House, and by 1837, at age 33, he was literally the youngest U.S. senator in the country. Fast forward 10 years to 1847, and he's commanding a volunteer brigade as a brigadier general in the Mexican-American War. He was building this huge national profile, blending political loyalty with military service. His ideological compass definitely guided these early successes, but, as we'll see, it would eventually become his fatal flaw. Let's skip ahead to the 1852 Democratic Convention. The party was just hopelessly deadlocked over sectional tensions. They couldn't pick a nominee after an exhausting 48 consecutive votes. Talk about a stalemate, right? But on the 49th ballot, everything shifted. Because Pierce had remained relatively neutral in national fights, yet firmly believed in states' rights, he emerged out of nowhere. He became the perfect dark horse compromise candidate to unite the northern and southern factions of the party. He was the safe bet. Section 2. Tragedy before the presidency. We really can't understand Pierce's presidency without understanding the totally devastating personal context in which it began. Just weeks before he was set to take the oath of office, Franklin Pierce and his wife Jane were involved in a horrific train derailment. While the parents survived, they tragically witnessed the death of their 11-year-old son Benny. It was a completely devastating blow. From a purely historical standpoint, this horrific loss severely compromised Pierce's psychological state right as he was assuming the most demanding job in the country. The crucial point here is how this immense grief manifested once they got to the White House. Jane Pierce became intensely isolated. People actually called her the shadow of the White House. And President Pierce? Well, he was left attempting to govern a deeply fractured nation while entirely consumed by his own mourning. The country desperately needed a focused, unifying leader, but Pierce's judgment and emotional capacity were understandably yet tragically clouded. Section 3. The Kansas-Nebraska Catastrophe. This clouded judgment collided directly with a pivotal domestic failure, and it all centered on the concept of popular sovereignty. This was the idea that settlers in a new territory should just vote to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. For Pierce, someone deeply anchored in states' rights, this probably seemed like a perfectly logical political calculation. Just let the people vote, and the democratic process will peacefully resolve the territorial debate, right? Well, reality had a very different plan. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 completely overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820. For over 30 years, slavery was prohibited north of a specific geographical line, the 36-degree 30 line, which had maintained a fragile peace. By backing the 1854 Act and replacing that line with popular sovereignty, Pierce essentially erased decades of established political balance. And this caused absolute outrage in the North. The mechanics of this failure were immediate, and they were violent. First, pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri flooded across the border into Kansas to vote illegally. This quickly escalated into the formation of entirely separate competing territorial governments within Kansas itself. The situation rapidly spiraled out of control until, finally, open warfare broke out. Towns were burned, including the infamous sack of Lawrence, which gave birth to the grim moniker, Bleeding Kansas.
Pierce's response to all this chaos was incredibly rigid. He strictly enforced the Kansas-Nebraska Act and officially recognized the pro-slavery territorial government, despite the rampant violence and well-documented voter fraud. The political fallout was mechanical and swift. Northern Democrats abandoned him in droves, and the outrage directly fueled the rapid rise of a brand new political faction, the Republican Party.
Section 4, Manifest Destiny and Backlash.
While domestic policy was imploding, Pierce was actually looking abroad, but his aggressive expansionist policies yielded wildly mixed results. The Gadsden Purchase in 1854 was a logistical success, acquiring 29,000 square miles from Mexico to help build a southern railroad. However, the Austin Manifesto? That was a complete disaster. This was a leaked, secretive plan to acquire Cuba from Spain by force if necessary. The public reaction was toxic, with the North viewing it as a massive conspiracy to expand slavery into the Caribbean. And his other foreign ventures suffered similar fates of perception. He recognized William Walker's brief rogue regime in Nicaragua, which, by the way, actually tried to legalize slavery. And even when his administration successfully expanded Pacific influence by opening trade with Japan, it didn't help his domestic standing, because the nation was so intensely divided. Literally all of Pierce's expansion goals were viewed by half the country through a highly suspicious sectional lens.
Section 5, A Fractured Legacy. By the end of his single term, Pierce had lost control of the narrative, his party, and his reputation. It resulted in a stunning reversal of fortune. At the 1856 Democratic Convention, Pierce faced a humiliation rarely seen in American politics. The incumbent president was unceremoniously dropped by his own party. The Democrats instead chose James Buchanan, a moderate who had been serving overseas and was completely untouched by the radioactive fallout of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Pierce was effectively exiled from national politics.
But even in his post-presidency years, Pierce's rigid ideology never wavered. In a fiery 1863 speech during the Civil War, he harshly criticized President Abraham Lincoln for suspending habeas corpus. He claimed that the principles of democracy and individual rights were being sacrificed for military necessity. It really demonstrates how, above all else, his commitment to states' rights and strict constitutional limits remained utterly unyielding, even when the nation was actively tearing itself apart.
The contrast of his political arc is staggering when you step back and look at it. He began in 1852 as a unifier, a landslide victor carrying the hopes of a nation. But by the 1860s, he was an absolute outcast. Isolated in New Hampshire, he was widely labeled as a Copperhead sympathizer for his criticisms of the Union war effort, and largely forgotten or reviled by the public. It is a complete destruction of public standing.
The big takeaway from this explainer is the mechanical nature of political collapse. Pierce sought to preserve the Union, but his rigid reliance on popular sovereignty and states' rights became the very wedge that shattered it. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. Does rigid adherence to ideology in a deeply divided nation inevitably lead to its fracture? It's a lesson from the 1850s that still echoes today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.